Hi, this is a Bible Forum. It's June 27, I think. I'm not sure. It's the last Sunday in June. I want to talk to you a little bit about U.S. history. When did you start school? I started school in 1948. I was out by 1961. 20 years later, you would not recognize our educational system. A fellow by the name of Stephen Flurry, writing in June of this year, 2018, talked about George Washington as the founding father of the United States. He was a national hero, a war veteran, and a victorious general. Washington sacrificed everything for his country. He was unanimously chosen to preside over the Constitutional Convention. And he was the first to sign the United States Constitution in 1787. He was the only president to lead an army into battle as commander-in-chief. He was the only person to be unanimously elected president, and the Electoral College unanimously elected him twice. George Washington was also a slave owner. And for many people in America today, that fact is the only one that matters. Prager University released a video on April 22nd this year, 2018, about a study it conducted on the George Washington University campus, asking students whether they thought the name of the university should be changed. The interviewer asked one young man, "What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say George Washington?" He replied, "I think about him owning slaves." The man said, "That's the first thing that comes to mind? This is George Washington we're talking about." The student didn't immediately think, "Oh, founding father, national hero, sacrifice for the country, Constitution, commander-in-chief, first president." He thinks slave owner. That turned out not to be unique. After 3 hours of talking to students all over campus, college students, they've been all through 12 years of so-called public school, a shocking 70% of the George Washington University students they polled thought the name of the institution should change. He was a slave owner. David McCullough wrote in his book entitled 1776, quote, "Without Washington's leadership and unrelenting perseverance, the revolution almost certainly would have failed." In other words, were it not for General George Washington, there would be no United States of America. We would theoretically be no different than South America. But these students believe Washington to be a slave owner and therefore not worthy to have his name associated with the college. Now, this is a willful ignorance of history, right? Not really. They don't know anything about our history. The website for Mount Vernon, Washington's home, highlights 10 facts you should know about our first president. One of those facts is that of the 12 presidents who owned slaves before or during their administrations, Washington is the only slave-owning president who freed all his slaves. Keep in mind, owning slaves in that era was not considered evil. It was a necessity. It was just what we did. And you think, "Oh, look, they think like that." They were thinking in 15th, 16th, 17th century ways. It's different. According to his will, the 123 slaves that he was responsible for would be freed upon his wife's death. He wrote to a friend in 1786, "I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by law. So why did he do it? He needed workers. He needed people who would work the farm, keep it going. Well, he could have hired American colonists and all the rest of it. Apparently not. Apparently not. The founders considered slavery an evil. Most of them considered it a necessary evil, and as Abraham Lincoln said, they placed it, quote, in the course of ultimate extinction, end of quote. They feared the political, economic, and societal problems of outlawing slavery immediately, but took major steps to restrict and ultimately starve out what Lincoln called the rattlesnake of slavery. They couldn't just let these people go for those people's sake. Prior to independence, colonial legislators tried and failed to ban the importation of slaves. There's always wicked men. After independence, states began restricting and eliminating the slave trade and slavery on their soil, not on economic grounds. Many found it financially advantageous to own unpaid workers, but on moral principle. Virginia, whose economy relied more heavily on slavery than northern states, passed a law in 1782 outlawing manumission, the voluntary freeing of slaves, which many used to free thousands of slaves. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson led an effort in Congress to outlaw slavery in all Western territories. It failed to pass by one vote. Congress also passed the landmark Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Article 6 of that ordinance says, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory." This law provided for the return of fugitive slaves, but slavery itself was outlawed in the land that eventually became Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Were you taught any of this in school? Or do you get your news from the television, the internet, and these people who go on and they just spout all sorts of things? This law was introduced by a motion in Virginia, which gave up its claim to land in the Northwest, to the land in Northwest Territory. Virginia, a slave state. And this effort was led by Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder. All of this before the United States even adopted the Constitution in September of 1787. The country was only 11 years old. The Constitution itself notably includes a compromise with slavery. But as Lincoln noted, it conspicuously avoids using the term, so that when slavery was ultimately abolished, the document would remain as unpolluted as possible by that term. Guys were thinking ahead to this sort of thing. They couldn't just erase the board. Slavery had been a widespread practice around the world. What we are not being told is that these were Mohammedans, Muslims, who were looting Africa and selling slaves to anybody that would buy them. Something they continue to do, by the way. But nobody turns that toward them, do they? Even our own president, a man of color, with a heritage in, always have to stop and think, West Africa, stood in the doorway of a slave market, looking out onto the ocean, dreamily imagining what his forefathers must have had to go through. Our former president, who's a Muslim, his fellow compatriots in the past. It was that group that was selling these people. We get this beautiful picture. Oh, history is like that. It ain't neat. And to go back into China, somehow condemn everything we have today based on the way it was 400 years ago, just doesn't make sense to anybody with a brain. Slavery had been widespread as a practice around the world, but the men who took the bold step of founding a completely new type of republic took the largely unprecedented step of attempting to gradually abolish slavery from the very beginning. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves, but voluntarily freed them and helped found the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. John Jay, Supreme Court, owned slaves, but tried to abolish slavery in New York the very next year after America won its independence, and founded the anti-slavery New York Manumission Society. Alexander Hamilton did not own slaves, but some of his work with companies and individuals dealt with slaves. He helped found the New York Manumission Society and the African Free School in New York City. James Madison, James Monroe, George Mason, and others owned slaves, but worked to end the practice. It is fair to say that many of our founders did not own slaves. And all states except one banned the transatlantic slave trade before 1800. Congress outlawed it nationwide in 1807. And at that point, this country, this nation, was only 31 years old. You would think that George Washington University students would understand all of this, or at least be familiar with the history. But instead, they have been trained. You hear Washington, you think slavery. George Washington University was founded in 1821 by an act of Congress. According to the George Washington University website, the university's goal was to fulfill the vision of our first president and now namesake's vision that our nation's capital be an educational center to prepare leaders. That was clearly written at a time when America took pride in the legacy of its preeminent founder. In 2018, however, the institution's own students want to erase that history. To suggest that association with slavery is the only criteria on whether a historical figure should be honored is faulty as an argument at the very least. Douglas Blackmun, an author and senior fellow of the University of Virginia's Miller Center, in responding to the idea said, quote, because one would be hard-pressed to find any 18th and 19th century leader of great consequence to American life who never owned slaves. You would think that if any historical figure would be untouchable, even for radical leftists, it would be George Washington. But our nation's founders, up to and including Washington, are all targets today. And we are now seeing the result of what professors and teachers have been teaching their students inside the halls of American universities, colleges, high schools, and grade schools for the last 75, 80 years. And our leadership corps in this country have all been educated in the universities that focus on this sort of thing. It shows just how truly ignorant Americans are regarding America's imperfect but inarguably noble history. Look at the personal history of this founding father, this man who was so devoted to the sacred fire of liberty, who realized that the destiny of the Republican model of government was finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of American people, as he said in his inaugural address. He realized that what he was doing as the pioneering leader would resound for generations. He knew that he was setting precedent for how presidents would act for the rest of the existence of this country. And he set that precedent in politics, in morality, and in character. that it took time somehow is immoral. Today, many young Americans want to erase those precedents and legacies of Washington and others. They want to start something new and different. They don't see him as the indispensable man, as one historian called him. All that they see is George Washington, slave owner. There are a small few who still hold on to this history. One of those students questioned by Prager University about whether or not George Washington University should change its name answered, absolutely not. This is one of our founding fathers. If we forget liberty, we forget the intrinsic nature behind the founders' philosophy of liberty. Then what exactly do we have? May his tribe increase. It's a probing question worth considering. Considering for that student's classmates and for our young Americans all across the country. How about you?